Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of Transparency Task Force, which is a UK-based certified social enterprise. Being a social enterprise simply means that we exist to make an impact, not to make a profit. And because of my financial services background and career, I came to the conclusion in 2015 that the good people in and connected to the financial services sector ought to be doing a better job of trying to make the industry more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy. And what started out as a little hobby, for want of a better phrase, ended up taking over my life. And very simply, the more time I spent as a campaigner for reform in the financial industry, the more I found my true purpose. I am off the scale passionate about the work that the Transparency Task Force does. And those of you who know me quite well will believe that and know that to be totally true. Up until 2019, Transparency Task Force was completely UK centric. But in one year during 2019, we managed to internationalize our work. I spent what was left of my life savings trying to find out whether people outside the UK could also relate to our collective endeavour to drive greater levels of transparency into the financial industry. So, in one year, I managed to organise and run meetings in Dublin, Amsterdam, Zurich, Brussels, Hong Kong, Singapore, Washington, DC, New York, Boston, and very importantly, Sydney and Melbourne. And my goodness me, how glad I was that we did that, because we now have approximately 1,000 people around the world who bring to us a truly valuable global perspective on the state of the financial services sector. I think it's fair to say that myself and my colleagues have got what must be one of the most useful international perspectives on things like financial services regulation. Another reason I was so pleased about what we did is because we managed to encourage about 50 people around the world to work with me to write a book. The book was called Why We Need to Drive Up the Levels of Transparency in Financial Services and How We Can Do It. And we've got that in hardback, paperback, and online version. And all sorts of really interesting people from around the world contributed to the writing of the book. In those travels, I met some individuals who, I'm not exaggerating, have had a profoundly positive impact on the cause of the Transparency Task Force. And without any shadow of doubt, one of those is Dr. Andy Schmulo, an individual who I rate so highly, not just because of what he knows, and he knows a great deal, but perhaps more importantly, because of his complete unwillingness to hide the known truth to the people around him. I think of Dr. Schmulo as a superb example of somebody who has a willingness to speak up and speak out, and when necessary, to talk to those in power, those in charge, and to challenge the status quo in a remarkably fearless way. Ladies and gentlemen, before I do anything else, could I please invite you to join me in very simply recognising the work that Andy Schmulo has done over many years, because it's made a huge difference to my outlook internationally, and also through that, the outlook of many others as well. So proud to say that Dr. Schmulo is a member of the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Investment, Fraud and Fairer Financial Services, which is going to be re-inaugurated later on today after the UK general election. Andy, thank you very much for being here. Senator Bragg, I don't know much about you, sir, but I do know what you've done in relation to your investigation and your report into ASIC. I cannot begin to describe to you, sir, how significant your work is, because myself and so many others in the UK are pretty jolly convinced that the issues you have found in relation to ASIC have comparable parallels to the regulatory framework in the UK. Hence the conversation we're about to have, Senator Bragg. You all know Senator Bragg in terms of his profile. It's on the events website page. We won't spend too much time talking about that. What we will do now is invite Senator Bragg to tell us a bit about himself, about the investigation, about the report, and feel free, sir, to take the conversation in any way you wish to. And after you've spoken, we'll have a few bits of Q&A discussion, and then we'll pass on to Dr. Shmulo and then to John Adams. So, Senator Bragg, thank you very much indeed on behalf of all of us. Can we please welcome Senator Bragg to the microphone to speak? Over to you, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. I'm sitting in Canberra at the moment, which is where our Parliament is, and Parliament is in session. So hopefully I can get through the next 10, 15 minutes without any division bells ringing. Look, one of the main things we do in the Australian Senate is we have a committee system, which we borrowed from the United States in the early 1970s. And that committee system allows us to undertake serious and heavyweight investigation and inquiry into all manner of things across the economy and across the society here in Australia. And so with that tradition in mind, we have had a series of inquiries into the securities and corporate regulators over the past 30 or 40 years. And the latest inquiry that I conducted in the last 18 months was the third such inquiry. There was one in the early 90s, one in the 2012 to 14, and one now in 2022 to 2024. And I have to say that I was able to, in the course of this inquiry, talk to people who'd submitted to the early inquiry in the 90s. And they basically have made the point to me that very little has changed and that there is a culture of indolence in that the corporate regulator is not open to receive warnings and complaints about things and then act in a swift manner. And so what we have now in Australia is a very strong culture of corporate crime, white-collar crime, in a country which is a clean country. But there is a material level now of crime, which we see in the financial and in the corporate sector, which goes unpunished. And so our inquiry found, and the key finding was that effectively, if you break the law in Australia, there is a chance that you will be able to evade prosecution. And part of this is because the Parliament has given ASIC more and more responsibilities over the past couple of decades. And so effectively, we make the case that the remit is too big. If you look around the G20 and you look around the English-speaking world, I think you'll find that if you tip all the securities regulators on their side, that ASIC would be the one with the most responsibilities overall. And so it is too big to be effective. And so we recommended that there be a statement of expectations given to ASIC from the executive government. We had a change of government in Australia two and a half years ago, and ASIC has received no new statement of expectations from the government. We recommended that it be split into two parts, that there be a corporate and companies regulator, then there'd be a separate financial services agency. Now, one of the reasons for the separate financial services body is we have an unusual economy size and structure in that we have, I think, the 13th biggest economy on the planet, but we have the second or third largest pool of managed investments and pensions. And that's because we have a very unusual pension scheme in Australia. And there are a lot of financial sector components which feed off this organisation of compulsory pensions. And so I think that alone would give you enough ground to have a separate financial services agency. We also made recommendations around the protection of whistleblowers. I mean, whistleblowers in Australia are treated appallingly. We made recommendations about the internal governance structure, the board structure, the setting of statutory appointments, and we also gave recommendations on the funding of the organisation. Effectively, to cut a long story short, if you look at what happened with the FTX issue in the United States, you saw the people who had perpetrated crimes went to jail within 12 months. In Australia, if you commit a corporate crime, if you are referred to the Department of Public Prosecutions by ASIC and then tried in a courtroom, you may be waiting for 3 to 5 years or more, if at all. And so we want to have a culture where people are genuinely fearful of breaking the law, because otherwise, what's the point of having all these laws in the books? And we have a system in Australia where we have a lot of corporate laws, we have a lot of financial services laws, and very few of them are enforced. So I might just also say that one of the reasons we decided to have the inquiry was because we had received a lot of correspondence and a lot of evidence that there was a real problem. And I thought that as a legislator that we couldn't have a situation where we were going to have a loss of confidence in the system, that people would feel that this was a beyond material but systemic issue. And so that's why we established the inquiry. Now the inquiry has made its 11 recommendations. We are about to have a federal election here in Australia. And it is possible that some parties, some independents may adopt this ASIC reform as one of their policies. I'm hopeful my own party will consider it. And then in the next Parliament of Australia, we will be in a position to legislate parts of the report. It's often been the case that significant inquiries take time to gain traction and take time to be implemented by parliaments. I'm quite confident that there are parts of this inquiry report, particularly the breaking up of the body into more manageable elements, and some of the governance issues inside the organisations or new organisations. I'm quite confident that these will be adopted and implemented in the next 3 to 5 years, because I think that ASIC is in a position where it is not calibrated to be effective. And if you look at the data points around how many referrals have gone to the Department of Public Prosecutions and have led to custodial sentences or serious criminal penalties, it's going in the wrong direction. So every time there is a new financial or corporate scandal in Australia, people will rightly say, well, there's a report there that's been done that took 1.5 years that the Parliament has provided in a bipartisan way, largely bipartisan way, that could be deployed to improve the situation. And so ultimately, that's sort of where we're up to. I won't bore you with all of the various case studies, but I can just say this in closing, that there were so many cases where ASIC received warnings from the public and warnings from professional organisations, including professional bodies with standing in industry, in professional and corporate services and financial services, where if they had acted in a timely manner, then there would have been losses avoided. People would have been able to maintain jobs and maintain their savings, for example, and retail shareholders would have been spared significant financial losses. So if they had been able to enforce the law when they were given warnings about laws being breached, then we would have been in a much better position as a country. So that's why this is important, and it's why I was very pleased to chair this inquiry.
Mr. Senator Bragg, thank you so much. You've given us a tremendous overview of the investigation report, its importance. So much of what you've said, as I expected, frankly, resonates with me, and I'm absolutely sure with so many of the people in the Northern Hemisphere who are listening to you today. If I may, sir, I'll just pick on one particular point you've raised, which is remarkably interesting to me. And I'll find a chat to what I'm about to mention. I'll put it in the, I'll find a link to what I'm about to mention, and I will put it in the chat shortly, and you can all see it for yourself. A couple of summers ago, Transparency Task Force got involved with the BBC Panorama programme. And the BBC Panorama programme was fantastic. It was a proper 1 hour, heavy duty, proper forensic documentary on something. And the something was one of the investment scandals many in the UK have been very interested in, Blackmore Bond. Basically turned out to be a seriously problematic investment scheme that caused many, many, many people to lose a lot of money. And the kind of people we're talking about were people who were not wealthy. And if I can put it this way, sir, couldn't afford to lose the money that they lost. Yeah. Long story short, in London, in a London office, there were criminals, allegedly, making cold calls to typically elderly, vulnerable people, telling them that if they invested their money into Blackmore Bond, they would benefit from a good return, guaranteed return, safe as houses with the narrative, etc., etc., etc. By complete coincidence, next door to these folks making the calls was a bunch of financial services veterans who could hear what was being said because it was a really thin partition, a small glass, a very thin glass partition. Those folks in that room, led by a gentleman called Paul Carlier, one of our very significant members, Paul mentioned this to the Financial Conduct Authority. He basically said, and of course I'm paraphrasing, Senator, he basically said, "Dear FCA, I've got hard evidence of criminality going on, allegedly, next door. This is what they're saying. This cannot possibly be true. Here's all the information you need to go in there and close this thing down." Very long story short, a couple of remarkable things happened. Number one, it would seem the FCA did not follow up on that information. Paul chased many months later, and then he chased again many months later. He had reason to believe that conduct was continuing. And eventually, the FCA started to take some action. In the BBC Panorama documentary, you'll be able to literally see an initial report that was drafted, which made direct reference to the idea that the FCA was aware that it had missed an opportunity to act. You can literally see it in the documentary, the writing is there, and it then got edited out of the report. And my point is, and this speaks to your point, sir, is that hundreds, if not thousands of people ended up being caught by that particular scam after the FCA was given hard evidence that it was going on. And that's the kind of thing that frankly destroys trust and confidence in a regulator. I imagine, Senator, you've got many examples of that kind of thing in your world, sir.
Well, look, the most egregious case in Australia was in relation to a financial advice organisation called Dixon Advisory, where they had a series of warnings over many years where they didn't do what they should have done, which is to step in and enforce the law in relation to financial advice. And the result of them not acting meant that there were hundreds of millions of dollars worth of losses. And now we have a compensation scheme of last resort, which was established by the Parliament, which now raises the spectre of moral hazard. And it's been a very bad, a very bad outcome. So, but ultimately, when we have public hearings into ASIC and we ask them questions about these cases, they tended to obfuscate or pretended that didn't know the answers to the question, or they didn't know basic answers to questions. So, look, it was a pretty ugly inquiry. I've got to be honest with you and be frank. It wasn't an easy inquiry because I was very conscious that so many people have been wronged, and we wanted to try and put forward something that could be implemented, recognising that there are political constraints, that no one's going to deliver a massive law reform package like cutting the corporate regulator in half, within a few months. So my hope is that this can be adopted in part by the next Parliament of Australia, which will commence before the middle of next year.
Thank you, Senator. Various folks have put comments and questions in the chat. Please do answer that if you wish to. Meanwhile, could I invite anybody that wants to have make a quick point for Senator Bragg to do so? Please raise your hand so I can see you. And I'll go on what's called gallery mode, so I should be able to see you. Mr. Ian Duffel, please keep it as short as you can, Ian. I really do mean that because we want to get through as many comments and questions as we can, as short as possible. Ian, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Senator Bragg, absolutely fascinating to hear you speak, and I think you've underlined the key issues that we're seeing here with the FCA. My wife and I are a victim of a recent scandal, the Woodford scandal, where we've lost £100,000, and we invested in an investment fund based on the fact that there was a compensation scheme, financial services compensation scheme in place, guaranteeing up to £82,000. Which we regard as a statutory right. That has recently, a matter of a couple of months ago, been withdrawn in an action by the FCA in respect of the Woodford scandal, whereby they inserted a clause into a scheme of arrangements and told a few debatable truths, shall we say. My view, and this is based on my experience in commerce as well, is that the FCA at an employee level are paid very low salaries, not at the high end, but at the lower end.
Yep.
And I encountered a very similar situation in my previous commercial experience. At one end, you have retail, who is very low paid staff. At the other end, at the top end, you have the financial services, which is basically commissions based. And it's my view that the problem is you have relatively low paid staff who one can describe, without being rude, as a sort of a peasant army going up against the heavy cavalry of very, very highly paid people who are incentivized by bonuses. One might as well ask the drug cartels to form an association and self-regulate themselves, which seems to be the way the FCA like to look at it. Let the financial services regulate themselves. But there is too much money in the trough to create effective regulation because there's too much money to entice people to do wrong. Is that a similar situation that you have in Australia, do you think?
Look, a number of years ago, the corporate regulator was exempted from the Public Service Act, so they can hire people based on a close to market basis. But their problem is not that they're not losing to better barristers in the courtroom. They are losing because they're not being prepared to take courses. Sorry, they're not taking their cases into the courtroom at all. So that is their problem, that they're not prepared to take a risk. They want to win, and you can't guarantee that. So I would say they haven't got an issue with getting access to expensive personnel, which are required when you're going to have one of these big legal battles. Their issue is their culture, their structure, more so than that, because they've been exempted from the Public Service Act for some years now, so they can pay people market salaries.
If I may,
Andy, I can probably do one more. I have to go into the chamber, so I can do one more question.
Thank you very much indeed. If I may, Senator, I'll just briefly mention this point.
Yep.
In the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority is immune from civil liability, which we think is a real problem. It kind of means that when the FCA does get things wrong, and of course it does, like any organisation from time to time, it doesn't kind of feel any pain because it's so difficult for people to land a punch, for want of a better phrase. Any comments on that, Senator Bragg? And we accept that you'll need to get going shortly. Any comments on that before you need to depart? And then we'll go to Dr. Shmulo. Thank you.
Look, I mean, I think in general, the issue of personnel has been well and truly canvassed. I mean, I think they would need to effectively have a very clean structure where you have maybe a chief executive rather than having a board. And then you have very clear expectations about how you do law enforcement. I mean, I mean, even in the last few weeks, the chair of ASIC has been talking about all the things that he would like to investigate, not in a law enforcement sense, but just things that he's interested in. I mean, they're not a focused organization. The only thing they really fear is media exposure. And so I've often said that, if you discover a corporate crime in Australia, you may be better off reporting it to the media than reporting it to ASIC, because if the media report it, then ASIC will do something. So anyway, on that very positive note, I will have to go to the chamber, but thanks for the opportunity to speak to you, Andy, and all your members.
Can we please show our appreciation to Senator Bragg whilst also inviting Dr. Schmiller to the microphone? Senator Bragg, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Super stuff. Thank you. That was great. You know that card game Snap, folks, the one that you learnt when you were a little kid? When you're playing Snap, I don't need to explain how to play Snap, but I felt like I was playing Snap then. I really did feel like I was playing Snap. Every single point Senator Bragg just made, I can absolutely identify with from the UK perspective. That was great. That was absolutely great. Thanks, Senator Bragg. That's what you need, isn't it? Politicians who are willing and able to speak out and challenge the status quo. Dr. Shmulo, I won't big you up any more than I already have. You already know how much of a fan I am of you and your work. It really is wonderful to have you here. You've inspired this event. It's because of you that we're having it. Dr. Shmulo, please take yourself off mute and share with us your insights. This is going to be fascinating, folks, because Dr. Shmulo's got a wonderful international perspective on things. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, Andy, and good evening to colleagues. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. And Andy, thank you for such wonderful words of praise. But I have to say, if you think I'm that wonderful, I think you might need to get out more often. What I've done is really nothing special at all. I'm sorry, Senator Bragg has left, because I would have liked him to have heard what I'm going to say next. When his inquiry was launched a little over 2 years ago, I didn't have terribly much confidence that it would produce any meaningful outcomes. And I must say, I'm very happy to say I've been proved well and truly wrong. Senator Bragg ran an outstanding inquiry for a period of 2 years. They heard a great deal of evidence. He had to put up with what politely might be called challenges, what only fractionally less politely might be called absolute nonsense from ASIC, who refused to submit reports, who refused to submit to parliamentary sovereignty, who were caught, thanks to my colleague, John Adams, who you'll hear from next, who is a freedom of information machine. Thanks to freedom of information requests that John Adams filed and pursued, we discovered that ASIC had been running around federal parliament lobbying MPs to undermine Senator Bragg's inquiry. This is not acceptable. They're not a private sector organization that has the right to run around Parliament lobbying MPs, don't introduce a mining tax. That stuff's bad enough. That stuff needs to be rooted out if we're to have any chance of saving democracy. But a Commonwealth government agency on the taxpayer's dime, running around federal Parliament trying to suborn a legitimate Senate inquiry, is offensive and outrageous. And I query whether you have any examples of that kind of louche, disrespectful, anti-democratic behavior from your regulators. As bad as the FCA might be, I wonder whether they've ever run around trying to do something like that. And in one of, and I'm touching on this for a moment because it's an insight into a deeper cultural malaise. One of the freedom of information requests that John Adams put in uncovered that ASIC had been, internal emails at ASIC that they'd been hatching a plot to plant a Dorothy Dixer. For those of you who are not in Australia, you might not know what a Dorothy Dixer is. Dorothy Dix was a agony aunt columnist for a Sydney newspaper, and it later transpired that she'd been sending herself questions, which she would then answer in her column. So Dorothy Dixer is a softball question. I don't know what it might entail, maybe a question to the chair of ASIC. You know, what challenges do you face being so pretty and smart? I don't know. But they were caught doing it. They were caught planting softball questions in an attempt to have the tail wag the dog. I'm speechless. Where is the understanding from an executive branch of government that the way in which democracy works might not be perfect, but this is how it works, is that as a federal government agency and a recipient of largesse from the public purse, you will be held accountable to the democratically elected representatives of we the people. Under those circumstances, you're doing what? You're trying to plant softball questions. This is an example of executive tyranny. This is an example of an agency that is off the leash, out of control, and barking mad. What do you mean you're planting Dorothy Dixers? Your role is to go before the democratically elected representatives of we the people and bend the knee. You report to us. And you're doing what now? You're planting questions to have the tail wag the dog. And when Joe Longo was questioned about this, his response, which is recorded in Hansard, was, and I quote, "It is what it is." So not only is this man, to my mind, incompetent, not only is he ineffective in his role, he is suffused with arrogated contempt for the parliamentary process. And I think that's unforgivable. And the fact that they were discovered means that Joe Longo, to my mind, is what you would get if you crossed J. Edgar Hoover and Benny Hill. It's Jekyll and Hyde meets Laurel and Hardy. But be that as it may, outrageous as that behavior was, and outrageous as it was that they had to be threatened with contempt of the Senate because they would not deliver documents to Senator Bragg's inquiry. This is an insight into an organization that is absolutely out of control. And why are they out of control? Because they can't do their job. They know that they are effectively defeated in doing their job. So they try and manage the perception of how they're doing their job. And while all of this is going on, we had a Royal Commission in 2018, and that Royal Commission found that misconduct in the Australian financial industry is out of control. It makes the malfeasance of Wall Street look like a kindergarten. The FinFuture White Paper that was published by a very eminent team of academics, my colleagues at the University of Melbourne, determined that 54% of the adult population of Australia, which would be about 11.5 million people, 54% of the adult population of Australia had suffered detriment because of misconduct in the financial industry worth in excess of $200 billion. That's a lot of money to shoulder for 11.5 million people to shoulder. And those people will not only retire worse off, they will have less money in their retirement, so they will have less opportunity to ventilate their human potential. A lot of people in the grey stage of their life who produce extraordinary things for society, but they do so in an environment where they have some kind of financial security. Not only will they suffer, but their children will suffer and their children's children. This is intergenerational detriment. And Commissioner Haynes said The problem with ASIC is ASIC doesn't enforce the law. He said it so many times. He said it on so many occasions that it's become like a mantra. ASIC doesn't enforce the law. He added to that. ASIC must stop treating regulated entities like their customers, like their clients. In my words, ASIC must stop behaving like a glorified office works. Their role is not to facilitate business. Their role is to enforce the law. And it's not my opinion that they haven't been enforcing the law. These are the findings of the 2014 Senate inquiry, which found that ASIC was weak, feckless, and suborned. It was the finding of the 2014 Murray inquiry, which found that ASIC, Murray didn't have much of a remit to look at this particular issue, but he cast aspersions on ASIC's enforcement. This was the finding of the 2015 Treasury Capability Review, that ASIC only goes after low-hanging fruit, and they never take on the top end of town because they're scared to, and we know they're scared to, because that evidence came out at the next inquiry, the 2018 Hayne Royal Commission, where there were emails from people in ASIC saying, well, look, we'll threaten Westpac with litigation and hope to God they believe us, because we wouldn't actually take them to court. And then it was the finding of the 2024 Bragg inquiry. How many times do we have to reach the same conclusion that ASIC doesn't enforce the law before we say, you know what, I think ASIC doesn't enforce the law? 2014 Senate, 2014 Murray inquiry, 2015 Capability Review, 2018 Royal Commission, 2024 Bragg inquiry. It's enough now. And so I was immensely impressed with the manner in which Senator Bragg ran his inquiry in the face of these challenges. I was immensely impressed by the fact that when he heard critical evidence, he incorporated that critical evidence into his findings. I've appeared before other Senate inquiries into, for example, the Financial Accountability Regime Act, and painstakingly explained to the committee why it's an accountability regime act that has no accountability. They just ignored it. And now they're running around going, oh, I'm not sure we can enforce accountability. So this happens, politics takes over, we get no result. And I think that the result that we got from Bragg was a very good one. And his recommendations are bold, necessary, sensible, and in my view, correct. And the single most important recommendation here is that ASIC has to be split up. Now, you know, at this point, often there's a lot of pushback with people saying, how's splitting it going to solve the problem? It's another regulator to pay for. There are reasons why ASIC needs to be split, which don't just go to its failure in enforcement, but are the root cause of its failure in enforcement. And I'd like to just touch on those. The second reason, I'll come back to them in a moment. The second reason why ASIC needs to be split, you have an organization in the United Kingdom called Companies House. And Companies House does some of what ASIC does. But even if you were to take all of the things that the FCA does and all of the things that Companies House does and put them together, it still wouldn't match ASIC. And there's a reason for that. And I'll deal with this one first because it's the easiest. We have, over an extended period of time, converted a very great many private law remedies into public law obligations. So I'll give you an example. In another Twin Peaks common law jurisdiction, South Africa, there's virtually nothing in the legislation about directors' duties. If using the South African terminology, if a director is delinquent, then it's the shareholders who will need to sue the director. In Australia and after Australia, in the United Kingdom, directors' duties were put into the legislation. Well, if you put them into the legislation, then whomever is empowered to enforce the legislation then has to enforce it, right? You can't just put it in the legislation, walk away. But we've added so many other things to our legislation, so many other things to ASIC's remit that Companies House doesn't do, like pursuing directors to punish directors if they are caught trading in insolvency. Every manner of company registration, reporting, all of that stuff. Insider trading, directors' duties, licensing requirements in the financial industry, target market definitions in the financial industry. The remit, ASIC's remit, I can't remember which author I cited in my report, in my submission to Bragg's review. It's in my report there somewhere. Evidence that ASIC has the broadest remit of any securities regulator in the world. Now, at the end of the Banking Royal Commission, Commissioner Hayne looked at the issue of splitting up ASIC, and he said words to the effect of, I won't recommend that ASIC be split up today, but we should review ASIC's performance in a couple of years. Those were his words, a couple of years, which is 2 years. We should review ASIC's performance in a couple of years, and if it's not working out, we need to revisit this issue. Well, it's been 6 years. It's been 6 years, and in May of this year, ASIC released a report about an investigation they'd done in the superannuation industry. So for those of you in the United Kingdom, superannuation is your retirement annuity. They're not all exactly annuities, but it's your retirement insurance product. Superannuation in Australia is compulsory, and that's very important. If you're going to make something compulsory, if you are going to gently push consumers towards the turning blades, if you're going to force people by force of law to be a member of a superannuation fund, then you must protect them. Especially with something like superannuation, which is a product that is so sophisticated and so long-term that really the only people who really understand superannuation, probably people who qualified as actuaries. For the rest of us, we need protection when it comes to superannuation. So ASIC released a report in May of this year in which they surveyed just 10 superannuation funds. We would have well over 100, I'm sure. But okay, I'll be fair to ASIC. I won't say 1 in 10 funds. I'll say, let's look at how much funds they have under management. And if you take that barometer, then ASIC did a report into somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of our superannuation market. And they found that 6 years after the Hayne Royal Commission identified charging fees for services that had never been provided, the so-called fees for no service scandals. 6 years after Commissioner Hayne said the fees for no service scandals is of the most egregious and it must stop. 6 years after that, 10 super funds are still charging fees for services they know they haven't provided. Now, I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy, so I call that fraud. I don't understand how that's not fraud. 6 years after Hayne, ASIC did a review and found that superannuation funds are still charging fees for no service. Just 10 funds in the amount of just shy of $1 billion a year. Now, you know, we bandy these figures around million and billion, and in the process, they lose meaning and they lose impact. Let me just reinforce the impact for you. Do you know how long it would take you to count to 1 million if you counted one number per second? 11 days. Do you know how long it would take you to count to 1 billion at one number per second? 32 years. $1 billion is still being thieved from superannuation fund members 6 years after the Hayne Royal Commission. And you know what ASIC's response was? And I quote verbatim, "We will consider taking steps against these funds." What are you considering? Are you waiting for the moon to be in Jupiter? Are you waiting for the tea leaves? What are you considering? What do you mean you're going to be putting trustees on notice? Surely you must be seeking to put trustees in jail. What is this about sending superannuation funds strongly worded letters? You should be sending them summonses. But this is what we get 6 years after Hayne. We'll consider taking steps from a weak, feckless, suborned regulator that complains about the fact that it doesn't have enough resources to tackle every complaint sent to it. But it's got the resources to run around Parliament lobbying MPs to undermine an inquiry and planting Dorothy Dixes. It's outrageous. So we've had this inquiry. We've seen that ASIC isn't performing. One of the reasons I've said to you is because their remit is too wide. Part of the reason why the remit is too wide is because we've converted private law remedies into public law obligations. The other reason is that the other reason why you need a dedicated conduct regulator for the financial industry is because the financial industry is orders of magnitude more difficult to regulate than any other industry on earth. This is one of the places where people miss the point. They think they're all the same. Telecommunications, healthcare, oil and gas, financial industry, they're not. Barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. It'll be a barrel of oil on Monday, it'll be a barrel of oil on Tuesday. But a financial product or a financial service is an immaterial thing. It is an intangible thing. And it exists only in our minds. And most often, it takes the form of promises. And so as many ways as I can explain what is in my mind, as many ways as I can explain my idea for a product or service, so there are as many ways that I can define it as a product or service. So regulators can't keep up. The industry innovates so quickly that regulators cannot keep up. As one author put it, they're always stuck fighting the last war. The financial industry innovates more quickly than any other industry on earth. A lot of that's faux, but some of it's real, robo-advice and artificial intelligence. But a great deal of that innovation is tweaking the definitions of products or services, and firms tweak the definitions of products and services in the financial industry in order to advantage themselves. And it's so well known and well understood, it has a name. The name is regulatory arbitrage. And so firms tweak the definitions of their products and services so that they can get around the regulations, and so the regulations won't obstruct them from doing what they want to do. That's the one reason. The second reason is the financial industry touches the lives of more people. 99.94% of Australians over the age of 14 have a bank account. Every Australian, including a newborn baby that somebody wants to feature in an advert, if that baby gets paid a salary, it's got to have a superannuation account. The number of transactions that it performs every day are so voluminous that they dwarf other industries. That's another reason why you need a dedicated regulator. And then the last set of reasons, but by no means least, quite the contrary, the most important, is that the financial industry operates in the face of unique risks, systemic risks, which is a fancy way of saying a risk of a financial crisis eventuating. That only affects the financial industry. It doesn't affect any other industry. And financial crises take hold through a process that is known in the technical literature as contagion. So if people start queuing up outside ANZ Bank to withdraw their deposits, because ANZ Bank is created on a business model of fractional reserve lending and maturity mismatching, and because they only keep a fraction of their demand deposits liquid, people queue up around ANZ Bank to withdraw their deposits, the bank will become technically insolvent. You folk in the United Kingdom understand this only too well, because you will have remembered the queues outside the doors to Northern Rock. When those queues happen at one bank, through a process of herd hysteria, they spread to other banks. They spread to other banks, even though those other banks are healthy, well run, well capitalized, and have very strong balance sheets. It is an irrational fear that spreads contagion from one banking institution to the other, but whether it's an irrational fear or a rational fear, it is a fear that exists. And it exists sufficiently demonstrably that we have names for it, contagion. And in fact, for those of you who might have seen a movie with Russell Crowe called A Beautiful Mind, a biopic of John Nash, the Nobel Prize winner. Nash's work on herd behavior is instrumental to our understanding of the contagion risk between financial institutions. And so the way that contagion risk creates an industry that's unique, and I'm going to try and, Andy, please, if you can help me here. If Tesco goes bankrupt, that won't cause, give me the name of another UK supermarket.
Sainsbury's.
Won't cause Sainsbury's to go bankrupt. In fact, Sainsbury's will increase their market share. If ITV goes bankrupt, it'll have no effect on what's another private
Channel
Sky,
4.
Channel 4. If is there still an airline called British Midlands?
I think it went under, but we do have British Airways.
Another one. I need another one.
Oh,
in the UK.
Flybe.
Okay. If Flybed,
Flybe.
Fly what?
Flybe.
Flybe. If Flybe goes bankrupt, it won't cause British Airways to go bankrupt. But if Barclays goes bankrupt, if Barclays becomes insolvent, it will take all of the other banks down in the financial industry. That's the systemic risk that the financial industry faces. No other industry faces that kind of systemic risk, which is why you need a conduct regulator that is dedicated to the financial industry. Now, 20 years ago, people would have disputed what I just said. You need a conduct regulator that's dedicated for the financial industry because of the systemic risk. And they were going, no, it's not true. The only thing that causes systemic risk and the only kind of regulator you need in the financial industry that needs to be dedicated is the prudential regulator, because it's prudential unsoundness which causes a financial crisis. Not after the subprime disaster. After the subprime disaster, reckless and predatory lending on an industrial scale metastasized into the biggest financial crisis we've seen. So we're settled now. We need a dedicated prudential regulator and we need a dedicated conduct regulator. And that's exactly what the Twin Peaks model advocates for. Twin Peaks model was developed by a truly wonderful human being by the name of Dr. Michael Taylor. He's an Englishman. He was a senior official at the Bank of England. Nobody in the UK paid him any attention. Australia adopted the Twin Peaks model first, and the UK followed Australia later. But what we have done and what we've done incorrectly is, instead of creating a prudential regulator that is focused on the financial industry and a conduct regulator that's focused on the financial industry, instead what we've done is we've created a prudential regulator focused on the financial industry and a conduct regulator focused on the financial industry, insolvency, insider trading, directors' duties, company registration, and absolutely anything to do with business, money, the economy, or anything else except partnerships regulator. And the remit's too broad. And these were the findings of the House of Commons and the House of Lords reviews inter alia, the FSA, in the aftermath of the financial crisis. That the remit was too broad. And one of the individuals who serves on the APPG that Andy and I are on, and that some of you may have encountered, is the very wise and eminent and magnificent Professor David Llewellyn. And Professor David Llewellyn describes this accretion of jurisdiction, this constantly growing set of things that you have to enforce. He refers to it as the Christmas tree effect. And as the remit gets broader, so as the Christmas tree gets ever more laden with shiny baubles, so the job becomes more difficult. Now, at this point, let me say, when Commissioner Hayne looked at this issue, he said, with adequate resources and the right leadership, I see no reason why ASIC can't discharge its remit. He then went on to say, but we must look again in a couple of years. At this point, I would like very respectfully to disagree with Commissioner Hayne, and I do so cautiously and respectfully. He was a judge of our High Court, but I wish very respectfully to disagree with him. When he says, with adequate resources and the right leadership, ASIC can discharge its remit. With adequate resources and the right leadership, anything's possible. The question is, what regulator of what industry, in what jurisdiction, over what period has ever been adequately resourced? And as for the right leadership, well, that's a lucky dip. But on top of that, because the financial industry is so difficult to regulate, you need to take account of the following. The broader the remit, the more difficult the task. And tasks that are more difficult are less likely to be achieved. That's due to a phenomenon known as life. That is inevitable. The broader the remit, the more difficult the task. The more difficult the task, the less likely you are to achieve it. So what we are facing in Australia, which is just this, Australia likes to say we survived the global financial crisis. No, we just delayed it and instead turned it into a financial regulatory crisis. And it's still burning. May of this year, ASIC fines by funds under management, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of our superannuation industry is stealing $1 billion a year. They put it out as a press release and they think they've done their job. It's extraordinary. So there are other problems that won't be addressed by splitting ASIC up. But if for the first time we have a dedicated conduct in the financial industry regulator, let me put it to you this way. Regulating the financial industry is so difficult and has failed on so many occasions that if you don't have the optimal architecture, the optimal regulatory architecture, you're guaranteed to fail. Whereas if you have the correct regulatory architecture, then instead of being guaranteed to fail, you'll massively improve your chances and it'll merely be highly probable you'll fail. That's how hard it is. So don't even think about messing with the optimal model. The optimal model is giving you the slimmest possible chance. We are nowhere near that in Australia. And it's dispiriting and it's frustrating and it's annoying that, I was the first academic in Australia to support the call for a Royal Commission. I supported that call longer and more consistently than anybody else. I've been doing it for 10 years. And, for me, even I'm starting to sound like a stuck record. It's becoming boring. So anyway, I'll stop talking and hand over to John Adams, who is a tour de force. John Adams, the whole Bragg inquiry began because of John Adams. So you're about to hear from him. John Adams is a freedom of information machine. And his research, he's an economist. he took ASIC's enforcement track record. He did, I believe, what's called a regression analysis. And he came to the conclusion that of all the complaints that are filed with ASIC, they prosecute or maybe investigate, John will confirm, 0.3%. 99.7% they do nothing with. And let me leave you with this anecdote. Insolvency practitioners in Australia are extremely well qualified people, right? It's a very, very difficult industry to be in. You have creditors trying to find out where you live so that they can threaten your life. And you have to work under enormous time pressure. And they employ some of the smartest lawyers and forensic accountants going around. Those people are required by law to file a report with ASIC if they see something that was done wrong that caused the company to become insolvent, like trading in insolvency, which is an offense in Australia. If they see that stuff happening, they have to submit reports to ASIC. They, by all accounts, submit huge reports with detailed forensic accounting, legal analysis. ASIC announced that they had deployed some kind of generative AI, and the generative AI was now processing these insolvency briefs in something like, I think it was 37 seconds. So what has ASIC done by deploying this wonderful technology? They've become much faster and more efficient at not enforcing the law. Over to John.
Dr. Schmuller, thank you so much. Before we go to John, we'll deal with a couple of points. First of all, I've had the pleasure of listening to you speak on many occasions, as you know, and every time I do, I learn more. I'm sure lots of people in this call are going to want to join me in thanking you for setting out so clearly an analytical, evidence-based analysis of what's going on in Australia. And I obviously understand fully your international perspective means that your comments about the Financial Conduct Authority are also remarkably interesting to us. Folks, can I please invite you to join me in thanking Dr. Schmuller? That was particularly good, Albie. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. The pleasure and the privilege was all mine.
Thank you. And before we go to John, there's something else I want to do. There's a real danger, folks, a real danger that when we talk about things like regulatory failure and failure to enforce and failure to look at details and all the rest of it, there is a real danger that we lose touch with the human dimension to all of this. The human dimension to all of this. Now, in a moment, I'm going to put a link into the chat. In fact, I'm going to put 2 links into the chat that I want you all in good time to take a look at. Not now, listen to John Adams. It'll be very interesting indeed, I know. But please find time to look at the 2 links I put into the chat when you can. We'll be circulating the chat when the notes are sent round after today's event, probably sometime tomorrow. The first I'm not going to dwell on because it's so upsetting. Long story short, one of our volunteers, Ian Davis, took his own life as a consequence of a catastrophic regulatory failure, a proven, reported on catastrophic regulatory failure. The scandal was called London Capital and Finance. Ian lost about £600,000 just before reaching retirement as a consequence of a proven catastrophic regulatory failure. If you want to know more about the matter, then Google Dame Elizabeth Gloucester, London Capital and Finance, and you'll see all the evidence that you want to, that it was a catastrophic regulatory failure. We knew Ian well enough to know, no, I'll rephrase that. We knew Ian well enough for me to suspect that Ian didn't hang himself because of the money that he lost. He hanged himself because 3 years after the event, after he lost his money, he metaphorically speaking, went round and round in circles, trying to piece together all the evidence he could find about the perpetrators in the scam. And he got passed from pillar to post. Ian, in my opinion, lost the will to live, literally, as a direct consequence of the frustration of being turned away from various agencies and bodies. You'll see what I mean when I put the link into the chat. The link will take you to what's called an early day motion, which is when parliamentarians choose to formally make a statement about their disquiet about something. The second thing I'll put in the chat touches on an issue that Dr. Smulo just referred to. It's a piece of research by Oxford University that talks about 10,000 people taking their lives as a consequence of malpractice in the financial sector. 10,000. That's across UK, mainland Europe, Canada, and the US. And of course, that happened as a direct consequence of the global financial crisis. We know that global financial crisis was contributed to by a deregulatory agenda, but amongst other things included the repealing of the Glass-Steagall Act, the very kind of regulatory capture issues that Dr. Schmidt has just been talking about. We could get seriously depressed about the consequences, the human cost and suffering as a direct consequence of when regulators fail to do their job properly. But rather than getting angry about it, let's channel our energies collectively, both hemispheres, to demand a kind of positive, progressive, and purposeful reform that is oh so obviously desperately needed. Dr. Schmiller, thank you again. John Adams, please take to the mic and tell us your story in relation to what you did, sir, to make a difference. And it most certainly has. John Adams, thank you very much indeed. Can we please welcome John to the microphone? Well done, John. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, yes. So I was going to say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today, particularly to our in terms of the British audience. Andy, I'll probably what I want to do is give your audience some contextual information so you can understand Senator Bragg and Andy Schmuller's comments, and then I'll go into some of the specific work that I focus on. The important thing that that you in the UK need to understand is I think Senator Bragg and Andy talked about how there is a long-term problem with financial regulation and corporate regulation in Australia. And those problems obviously have compounded over the years. What people need to understand about this recent Bragg Inquiry report is that by any stretch of the imagination, ASIC today is the worst it's ever been, and it's been around for 35 years. Now, the Bragg Inquiry report was I told the press it was a historic landmark and once in a generation, because for the first time in 35 years, an Australian senator was prepared to stand up and say that it was time that we abolish ASIC and create two brand new agencies. Now, why is ASIC so bad at the moment? It's because of the leadership. For you and your colleagues over the UK, earlier this year, I think it was one of your TV stations released the Bates versus the British Post Office series. When I watched that series and I saw how the British Post Office behaved, I said to people in Australia, this is ASIC. ASIC, and again, I can't speak about the FCA conduct, but the closest behavior type that I've seen on television is the British Postal Office. Now, my background, yes, I'm an economist. I started my career in the Commonwealth Public Service. So I've worked in the private sector. I've worked about a decade ago. I was an economic advisor to a senator, and I've worked as a public servant. I've worked in good environments. I've worked in bad environments. I have never in my life seen anything remotely close to ASIC. Its conduct and its culture, it is just off this chart. It's just off the charts. And we really have to get into the realm of corruption, because I seriously believe that there is systemic corruption at the top of ASIC. Now, again, before we get into the specifics of some of the work that I've done, Andy is correct. I did trigger the inquiry by writing a report in 2022. In the course of 2023, I was able to bombard ASIC with a series of freedom of information requests. We were able to find a number of incriminating emails. I have a YouTube channel called In the Interest of the People. We've been breaking some of the biggest stories with ASIC on the alternative media, because some of the actual mainstream media journals are actually captured by this regulator. And so some of those incriminating emails found its way into the Bragg report. Now, what's instructive about this corruption and this toxic culture at ASIC is last year we had the 2023 staff survey results, and by any stretch of the imagination, this staff survey is the worst in the 123-year history of the Commonwealth government in Australia. So the federal government in Australia was created in 1901. So let me give you some of the, 1,056 ASIC staff responded to the survey, 61% of the staff responded. So let me give you some of the numbers. So on a scale of 0 to 100, role clarity, do you know your job at ASIC? 26%. Motivation, 22%. Satisfaction, 18%. Intention to stay at ASIC, 31%. But the absolute killer was this measure called organizational level quality. 1,056 staff at ASIC ranked ASIC at 2%. I kid you not, Andy, 2%. So a lot of people in the Australian press like to call me a conspiracy theorist, because I tend to, on a whole host of matters, I tend to sort of lead the debate in a number of areas. And I had a number of people attack me, including the current chairman of ASIC, in the press about some of my analysis. And yet when ASIC's own staff rank their own leadership at 2%, you don't need to listen to me or Professor Schmuller or anyone else. ASIC's own team is saying that it is catastrophically bad. Now, during the ASIC inquiry, I had the opportunity to meet James Shipton, the former chair of ASIC. I had the opportunity to have a number of conversations with James Shipton, and while there were problems while there were some issues when he was the chair of ASIC, ASIC has completely gone off the rails under the current chairman and under the current deputy chair. So all of these sort of behaviors that Andy was talking about, I mean, Senator Bragg said it was an ugly inquiry. They attempted to block information going to Parliament. So one of the big themes, I think, if you're thinking about FCA reform, the biggest theme has to be is there has to be a parliamentary accountability. And these people try every trick in the book to not be accountable to Parliament. Dorothy Dix's trying to rig motions before the Senate. Earlier this year, they called up a senator, and so in the Australian Senate, we have a process called Senate estimates, so where the senators get to ask public officials 3 times a year questions about the use of public expenditure. There was a matter that a senator was going to ask ASIC about something that they'll talk about shortly, and someone senior at ASIC called the senator and asked them not to ask a question. I mean, that type of behavior is just completely out of control. Now, the other thing I would say is, so the inquiry looked at the handling of reports of alleged misconduct, but it also looked at investigations and investigation quality. And while there was a number of case studies that the inquiry heard, Senator Bragg, I think the inquiry report focused on 4 case studies. Now, in the last couple of years, we've had the federal parliament have created a new national anti-corruption body called the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Andy, just for the purposes of the audience, I just want to read the NAC. The acronym is called the NAC. So the NAC published its corporate plan last year, and it talked about integrity in the Commonwealth Public Service. I just want to read this definition because I think this is so critical in the context of ASIC. So it says that integrity involves making decisions and giving advice honestly and impartially on the evidence and the merits in the public interest, and without regard to personal interests, accepting responsibility for it including for mistakes and reporting honestly. The problem with ASIC at the moment is the decisions that they are making on investigations. It is, I mean, one of the big findings about the inquiry was that ASIC's work is completely opaque. It's hard to look into the black box to see what they actually do. But we are hearing reports that the current leadership, and this is one of the reasons why the staff survey results are so bad, is they are making decisions on matters irrespective of the evidence. And I've heard direct reports where the deputy chair of ASIC, Sarah Court, is calling up senior managers and telling them to either make a decision, to go left or to go right on an investigation, with no regard for the facts. And so we have a new national anti-corruption body saying that that's not the way the public service has to work. You have to, if you're going to conduct an investigation into a corporate or financial services matter, you have to follow the evidence wherever the evidence takes you. And if the law has been breached, you have to enforce the law. That's what taxpayers obviously expect, and that's what Parliament expects, because Parliament's passing these laws, and they basically want they want the authority of Parliament to be enforced in corporate Australia, but also in the financial markets. So now, okay, so I thought that is important to just put on the table. So we have some long-term historical issues, and obviously, as Senator Bragg said, the Parliament has continued to add more and more responsibilities onto ASIC's plate. And that has created this issue of a mandate and a remit that's too broad. And as Professor Schmuller said, it has to be broken up. But those structural resourcing issues have been in play for 30 years, and they are some of the factors for why things have gotten worse over the last 3 decades. But I would say that as we speak today, ASIC is at a low point. And it's not me saying that, it's the ASIC staff saying that. Only in the last 3 weeks, just to give you how dire the situation is, me and someone who's actually participating in tonight's conversation, there's a guy called Robbie Barwick. We did a YouTube video where we openly talked about ASIC corruption on YouTube for an hour. We published it online. And then 3 weeks ago, we literally got a handwritten note from an ASIC official on ASIC stationery, in an official ASIC envelope, who watched our show about corruption and said that, dear John Adams and Robbie, your videos is 100% spot on. I've been here for a couple of decades. It's the worst it's ever been, and it's actually worse than what you video. So the fact that we have veterans inside ASIC saying that the culture today is the worst it's ever been, and the corruption is vivid, it's pervasive, and it's all over the place. It's just, that's unbelievable. So I think people need to understand that's the context. And last year, I referred the former deputy chair of ASIC to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. My referral has been with the NAC for 400 days. She's under investigation for corruption, and we'll have to see what the outcome of that is. I've referred a whole bunch of other people recently, and that's been there for about 100 days, and that's going to go to a corruption investigation very shortly. So that's, I think, the broader context. Now, some of the specific work that I did. Now, in 2021, I was told by an employee of a particular firm in Sydney about corporate misconduct that he had witnessed at the company he worked at. So I decided to look into this issue. I got some legal advice. The legal advice was to go to ASIC. So basically, I prepared a 608-page file of evidence, went to ASIC, and I said, I want an investigation. When I didn't get the sort of reception that I was expecting and the level of engagement from ASIC, I said, well, something fundamentally is wrong here. And that's where the genesis of me writing my public report. So the public report was looking at 11 years of ASIC data from the annual reports about the handling of reports of alleged misconduct. And so while the numbers in like 2021, 2022 were very bad, what was more concerning was the trend. So you look at the reports that resulted in no further action. It went from 30% to 65% over 11 years. You look at dealing with whistleblower complaints, 91% was no further action. You look at the number of investigations, the number of investigations had collapsed from, I think in 2014-15, there was about 230 new investigations for that financial year, and then it had collapsed to only 100, in terms of only 100 new investigations. You look at the rate of investigation against the number of reports of alleged misconduct, that had collapsed to below 1%. Now, the interesting thing here about this particular metric is, so when I published my report, and this got national headlines with our national broadcaster, Economist claims that ASIC is only investigating less than 1% of reports of alleged misconduct. The statistic I had calculated was about 0.7%. But then in the course of the inquiry, ASIC actually revealed that there are 3 ways to get an ASIC investigation. Either the ASIC enforcement team starts their own investigation based on their own information. ASIC has a supervision team that are actually supervising and actually engaging with industry on a regular basis. An investigation can be triggered by this supervision team. But then the third category is when members of the general public or liquidators or in terms of other parties go to ASIC and say, I want an investigation. Now, if you consider that last category, members of the general public going to ASIC asking for an official investigation, and when we say official, this is Section 13 of the ASIC Act, the long-term average of the public getting an official ASIC investigation, it's 0.36%. It is almost impossible to get an investigation. Now, I can say that in the last 2 years, I've actually triggered 2 Section 13 investigations, and maybe I've set a national record, but the level of effort and the forensic evidence and the detail I had to go to trigger 2 official ASIC investigations, I knew that it was out of the reach of the average mum and dad retail investor. And so while I have the resources and the ability to put detailed files of evidence together, clearly spelling out where the misconduct is, the average person can't do that. And that's where I thought, well, let me go to Parliament and actually advocate for the inquiry. Now, because I've been in politics for 20 years, I have a bit of a general approach about how I go about doing these things. And in August of 2022, as I was finalising my report, I went around the Australian Senate and I basically knocked on a whole bunch of doors. And what I was able to find was universal concern about ASIC. I've been in politics for 20 years. I've never found a political issue where it doesn't matter if you're talking to the far left, to the far right. Everyone said to me, we know ASIC's a problem and we need to do something about it. And so that's where I was confident that if I published my report, advocated for the ASIC inquiry, that we would get the inquiry. And then obviously after 3 weeks after I published the report, the Senate voted 43-20 to trigger the inquiry. And then obviously in terms of that is the rest is history. So that's about the handling of reports of alleged misconduct. And I will say this to you, Andy, is that in the last 2 years, now ASIC labeled my analysis, and my analysis is based on their own numbers. They said it was superficial and oversimplified. But the biggest issue was not just about the point-in-time assessment, it was the trend. The trend over the last 11 years showed a massive decline in operational performance. And I had a meeting with ASIC officials, senior officials in September of 2022, and I asked them, what's the basis for the trend? Why is things getting worse? They couldn't explain it. And then the last couple of years, even through this ASIC inquiry process, ASIC could not explain why their own data was showing major operational decline when it came to handling reports of alleged misconduct. So the other thing I will say is I did trigger 2 ASIC investigations. One of the investigations, they spent $300,000 and spent 13 months investigating a particular company. Now, what I did, they wrote to me last August and said, after a thorough investigation, we find no evidence of a crime. Have a good day. what I decided to do with a team of investigators, we did something unique in Australian history. We bombarded ASIC with freedom of information requests. We had a senator in the Australian Senate who asked questions on notice, and we were able to reconstruct ASIC's investigation timeline chronology, basically on a day-by-day basis. So this is the most thorough reconstruction of an ASIC investigation we were able to do. And then we actually looked to see, well, what did ASIC do in this investigation? And what did the company also do during the investigation? And what we have been able to discover is that the company engaged in a illegal cover-up. And you know, I won't get into the detail, but we've had another regulatory agency declare that the company's actions during the ASIC investigation was unlawful. And now that's the basis where I've now taken, referred the current chairman, the current deputy chair, and a whole bunch of other people to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, because this is just unacceptable. Because, you know, they spent 300,000. I mean, and again, this is the other thing I'll say, Andy, is some of this expenditure that ASIC does, 13 months, $300,000, $300,000. This was a very simple investigation. The Parliament has given ASIC extraordinary powers, so ASIC has more investigative tools than frontline police. So one of the things that it can do that police can't do in Australia is, if you are questioned by police in a criminal investigation, you have the right to remain silent. With ASIC, the right to remain silent has been suspended. So, and Parliament did this on purpose. And the history of this is that Parliament took the view historically that it's harder to investigate white-collar crime than, say, petty criminal or drugs or something of that nature. So the right to remain silent will make it much harder to actually prove white-collar crime. So that's why if ASIC gives you what they call a Section 19 notice, it is illegal. It's a criminal offence not to attend, and it's a criminal offence not to answer the question. So you must answer the question. So the right to remain silent is obviously a very historic protection that comes from English history. And the Australian Parliament said we're going to suspend that for white-collar crime. So ASIC has enormous powers to use the powers of compulsion, search warrants, all sorts of interesting tools to actually get the evidence necessary to formulate a case around a case theory. And in this situation, they basically did everything that you're not supposed to do in an investigation. They basically allowed the evidence to be altered in a legal fashion. And basically the company is still operating in the market. So over the last few weeks, we've started to see media articles come out. In the next half an hour, Senator Roberts in the Australian Senate will be talking about this investigation. So we're starting to see some recognition about this in the Australian Parliament. But yeah, the ASIC of today, and I will say this, Andy, just in closing. As part of my investigation team over the last couple of years, I've had former ASIC investigators work with me, and they taught me everything that I know about, you know, how to run an investigation and what ASIC's supposed to do. So there was some very good investigators back in the 2010, 2011 period, and for some reason that previous generation of good investigators at ASIC, even though the ASIC had problems back then around the GFC. A lot of those people have left. The culture has declined, and the quality of work that is happening in terms of ASIC has just fallen through the floor. And so Senator Bragg said that the ASIC culture is sick, and it probably can't be fixed. So the only way to rectify the situation is to abolish ASIC and basically start again. And having seen what happened in the UK with the Fujitsu Horizon scandal and all the lies to Parliament. I mean, you had, I think the former British Minister, I think it was Ed Davey, said that the British Postal Office lied on an industrial scale. That's what ASIC does. They lie to the press. They basically lie to Parliament. There is evidence that they lie to the court in various cases. And there's two aspects to what ASIC does. In many cases, they do not pursue misconduct. But in some cases where they have a predetermined target, they will manipulate evidence to go after said individual. And I've been involved in a couple of matters where I've got to see what happens when ASIC has a vendetta against a particular individual, particular company. Obviously, not the big end of town, typically a smallish, medium-sized player. They will try to destroy that person, that person's company, that person's life. And there are clear examples. One of the tactics ASIC will use is have an ex parte hearing with the judge, lie to the judge, present false evidence, and get a ruling from the judge that will then basically lead to the company's demise. And then they starve the company of financial resources to mount any form of legal defense, and they run them into the ground. So some of this behavior will obviously, now we have a dedicated National Anti-Corruption Commission. I dare say that in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to start to see some of these practices closely examined by corruption investigators, because ASIC has been able to hide some of this behavior for a long time. Now, with some of the work I've done, and obviously with the Senate inquiry, we're now bringing sunlight to these individuals and these practices, and hopefully we can, take Australia into a better situation than where we are at the moment.
Mr. John Adams, I very frequently talk about the importance of people who speak out, people who have the courage, the conviction, the intelligence, and the wisdom to speak out. I'm hesitating because I don't really know how to put into words the value to society of you and people like you. I really don't know how to articulate that properly. In a moment, we're going to be hearing from Mark Bishop. I'm going to come back to yourself, Mr. Adams, in just a short while. In the meantime, please, please, please put anything in the chat that people can go to look at your work and your analysis, your podcast, and anything else, because it seems to me that what you've done is immensely beneficial for the cause. A cause that can really be summed up in just a few words first used by Justice Louis Brandeis back in 1914. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And it appears to me, sir, that what you're talking about is the need to disinfect a regulator. And boy, oh boy, can I relate to that at our end of the world, as you have at yours. Mr. John Adams, thank you so much. Can we show our appreciation to John, not just for what he just said, but also for what he did, Wonderful stuff, John. Thank you so much. Mr. Mark Bishop, great TTF ally friend, technician, advisor, over to you, sir. Please talk about what you think you've heard that makes you think that perhaps some of the issues at ASIC correspond to the FCA. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you everybody who's spoken so far. I was flattered to be invited to give verbal testimony to the inquiry about ASIC. For a moment, I thought perhaps they'll fly me over there, but sadly, it wasn't to be. So I kind of sat, in a freezing cold home office late at night in the UK, rather than basking in sunshine in Canberra. And I said my piece. The first thing that I said to them, which in a way I think was probably the most important part, was that I don't think Australia should use the FCA as a template. I think that, I wondered whether they had kind of wheeled me on as a kind of token Brit to say, well, actually the way we're doing it in the UK is something you could learn from. I absolutely don't believe that that's the case. I think actually there are many similar flaws in the financial regulation systems that we have in the UK and Australia. And it was merely most of that that I focused on. I can't actually find the transcript of what I've said, but I have found my notes. So this is certainly what I intended to say. Whether they asked me the questions that flushed out all of this, I don't know. So the first thing I said was probably the least bad Anglosphere financial regulation is in the United States. And the reason is that the SEC is quite strongly motivated to get people who've done bad things, including high profile targets, on a perp walk. And that's kind of politically seen as something to be achieved. and some big names do go to prison for a very long time. And I think that kind of brought me on to the next thing that I felt was important, which is go for the high profile targets. Target people from the big end of town, not the token small firms, and go for the individuals and not just the firms. And the reason why I say that is, in the UK, in the very rare occasions when actually anything is done to enforce against financial services, large financial services businesses, it usually comes in the form of a fine. And of course, in a large business, the people who are running the business and the people who are doing the misconduct are not the owners of the business. So when you find shareholders, you're actually fining innocent bystanders at best, and at worst, you're actually fining victims. And the reason why I say that is that the business might be owned or partly owned by its junior staff or by its customers, and also because the individuals who are shareholders are also likely to have to pick up any bill for redress. So you're fining innocent people as displacement activity to make it look as though you're cracking down on guilty people who are actually the executives in the organization responsible. And why is it, I suspect, that regulators go easy on those people? Well, it's because those are people that can offer regulators and politicians, and civil servants who work in the Treasury, what I call thank you jobs. So if you are good little regulators, good little politicians, or good little civil servants in the financial sector, there will be jobs waiting for you. Those jobs will always pay better than the jobs that you could get in the public sector. The solution is not to raise the pay of public sector jobs, it's actually to close down the revolving door. So I talked about that. I talked about the importance of transparency and accountability. I think maybe Andy mentioned, certainly somebody did, that in the UK, the FCA cannot be sued, or it can with two tiny exemptions that have never been tried, and they're so small they would never actually work. So you can't sue regulators, and that's one of the reasons why they behave as they do. I said that it's essential to not just protect, but also reward whistleblowers. And some people would say, is it right to pay whistleblowers rather than simply protecting them? The reason why I think is this: if you just think of it in game theory terms, if all you do is protect whistleblowers, then there are two possible outcomes from blowing the whistle. One is the protection works and you lose nothing. The other is the protection doesn't work and you lose everything. So overall, you're losing. You know, it's not a winning game. Whereas if there are three outcomes, which is you win a big prize, or you end up quits, or you lose money, as long as the prize is big enough, it becomes worth playing the game. So you do have to reward whistleblowers. And it's also actually a nudge policy, not just an economic policy, because if you reward whistleblowers, the message you're sending out is blowing the whistle is a good thing to do. And one of the things we have in Anglo-Saxon societies, and of course there are cultural differences, except between the US, Australia, and the UK, but we're essentially kind of these Anglophone, Anglo-Saxon countries, is that we are ambivalent about whistleblowing. On the one hand, you can say, actually the courageous individual who stands against the organization is somebody that we celebrate. But on the other hand, you could also say, take one for the team, don't welch on your mates. There are other cultures where going against the organization and being a whistleblower is more clearly rewarded, and others where it is more clearly condemned. Because we sit on the junction between the two, it matters that we send out the signal. I talked in the context of transparency and accountability about what's known as the FRA, the Financial Regulators Assessment Authority, which is an organisation or an entity set up in Australia following the Hayne Commission to review periodically the behaviour and the performance of ASIC. And the idea was every 2 years it would review whether ASIC was doing a good job of protecting consumers. Unfortunately, its first chair was a banker, one actually who has been associated with misconduct. Surprise, surprise, he decided the first review didn't really need to look at how banks were being regulated. And then the next step was actually these reviews will happen only every 5 years. And I said, well, I think ASIC was that the FRA is a really good idea. You should hold it at least every 2 years, It shouldn't be run by a banker. So that I thought was common sense. In the UK, of course, we don't have such a thing. Transparency Task Force has said that we do need such a thing. I think we've called it the, I can't remember what it called, we came up with an acronym for it. And we said it should also be responsible for appointing some of the key individuals. So those individuals there reflecting consumer interests, not industry interests. Of course, that has kind of gone nowhere. Which kind of brings me on to something else, which I think is a shared kind of set of observations. And this is a kind of meta observations, if you like now. These are not proposals direct for reform. It's this. If you look at both ASIC in Australia and the FCA in the UK, both have been involved in a series of scandals, regulatory failures. Both of them have been subject to a number of critical reports. And in both cases, there appears to be some level of recognition on both sides of the house politically that it is an organisation that is failing or has failed, which in a way is kind of a good thing. You know, best to have a conscious incompetent than the reverse. But actually, what you get is another problem, which is although politicians recognise that the regulator is failing, those who have power, as in the front bench politicians, I'm not talking about backbenchers, but front benchers are disinclined to do anything about it. So, you know, we've heard, for example, that there is a cross-party consensus that ASIC is failing, but actually we've also heard that the current Labour government in Australia is unlikely to implement the key recommendations of this inquiry into ASIC. The person who called for this inquiry, Senator Bragg, he is from the Liberal Party, the equivalent of our Conservatives. And he said, well, maybe when we get into power, we'll make those changes. I confidently predict that they won't. It's nothing to do with Senator Bragg. It's to do with a political phenomenon that's called corporatism. Corporatism is the phenomenon whereby those who actually wield power, as opposed to the kind of lobby fodder, those who have actual power, are very subject to influence and lobbying from politicians, which is the next kind of thing that I think is a significant factor. Let's imagine that, you know, in the UK, John Adams was campaigning against the FCA, a thing which I've been involved in for about 12 years now. He might decide to write to the relevant minister and raise some concerns. I've tried doing that. In the UK, I can tell you that the private office of the city minister, as we call it, has at any one time at least one and possibly two employees seconded from the FCA dealing with that minister's private correspondence. I can't prove that the correspondence doesn't reach the minister. I can't prove that if it does reach the minister, there'll be a briefing paper accompanying it saying, actually, this is not quite the full truth. You know, things aren't as bad as been described. I also can't prove that the FCA would be tipped off about that person having written. But they can't prove the opposite. What do you think is most likely? Why would you think the FCA would bother to second people into the minister's office if it wasn't to blunt any criticism, get a heads up in advance? You also have lobbying. You also have monitoring social media of campaigners. You know, I'm one of the many people that's happened to. Correspondence into individual employees of the FCA gets diverted when you're a campaigner, and it goes to effectively a rebuttal unit. It's not called a rebuttal unit, but that's what it really is. So the other thing that you can find that when you kind of been doing this for a long time is a feeling that, you know, where the flaws exist, those flaws may not be actually accidents. They may be features, they may be part of the design. That actually financial regulators are designed to look as though there is financial regulation, not to create the reality of financial regulation, because it's actually easier for the bad actors in the industry to have something that looks like a regulator than to have nothing. If there's nothing there, there'll be a campaign to create a regulator. But if there's a regulator there, and actually, you know, there's a bit of sniping around the edges, but the regulator allowed to get on with its job, actually, there's not much you can do to campaign against that. So really what I suppose I'm saying here is that I think we both have in common defective financial regulators. We have some fairly similar solutions to fixing them, but those solutions will forever be thwarted until you somehow persuade politicians that there must be actual change.
Folks, I'm now walking the streets of London from Punter Southall Analytics. Well done, Punter Southall Analytics, for giving me an office to use. I'm on my way to Parliament to be involved, hopefully, in the creation of the all-party parliamentary group on investment fraud and fairer financial services, which is being reconstituted post the election. I personally think that this has been one of the most important Transparency Task Force events we've ever had. I'm at Trafalgar Square, folks, walking backwards, because I personally think that anybody at the Financial Conduct Authority, at the Treasury Committee, at the Lords Financial Services Regulations Committee, anybody on any of the all-party parliamentary groups that have an interest in financial services, who watches this recording, the recording of today's meeting, and will listen to the testimony from no less than Senator Bragg, Dr. Shmulo, John Adams, Mark Bishop. Nobody who listens to this testimony, who is independently minded and objective, will, in my opinion, be able to come up with any conclusion other than the idea that the Financial Conduct Authority might be, I repeat the phrase, might be suffering from the exact same issues that are relevant to ASIC. And therefore, on the basis that the FCA might be suffering from the same issues, there urgently needs to be a suitably thorough and independent assessment of the FCA, just in case the problems that we are talking about do apply in the UK, as they clearly do in other parts of the world. I'm going to do my best to facilitate further conversation amongst us. Can I, in a moment, go to Dr. Shmulo? Can we go back to you, Andy? Please share any final comments you make. I'll then invite John Adams to do the same, then to Mark Bishop, and then we'll start bringing our conversation to a close. Dr. Shmulo, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Mark Bannister has had his hand up for quite some time. I might defer to you.
Andy, as you can see your screen far better than I can right now, would you kindly volunteer to kind of effectively co-chair the session with me? So please, let's go to Mark Bannister. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you both, Andy and Dr. Shmulo. I've listened with great interest and intent to everything that's been said, and I feel that there's an element of somewhat of despair in all of this. And so I'd like to offer a positive outcome that you might like to all consider. And that is, sorry, apologies, I need to just cancel that. It's an absolute classic that the phone rings just at the wrong moment. Anyway, apologies. There is a circumstance where in the past there was a situation in the UK where travel companies, and this was particularly in the 60s and 70s, travel companies went bust, stranding their customers abroad with no way of getting home. And so the industry set up something called ABTA, which was basically a bonding system. And similarly, airlines have something called ATOL. It's the air travel operators license. And the industry has to pay into this fund to ensure that when fraud or problems or these companies collapse, the customers are returned to the UK and refunded. And we could easily see that implemented in the financial service industry. And what it does is it creates an internal mechanism of policing, because these firms do not want to pay for other firms that go bust. So they whistleblow on their competitors, and they monitor them, and the whole situation is greatly improved, and it impacts all the tertiary companies, lawyers, suppliers, all sorts of people. And if we implemented that across the financial service industry, a lot of the problems that we see would go away. The other thing is that clearly what has come out of today's discussions is that there is a fundamental failure, not probably so much with the organizations, but with their leadership. It's the leadership has gone so badly wrong, and that we need to see reformed. And I would just like to offer you an anachronism. Sorry, not an anachronism. I've forgotten the word I want to use, but anyway, apologies. We need responsibility, accountability, and jeopardy. And for jeopardy, you could substitute the word peril, and then you would have it as RAP. We need a RAP on all of this, okay? And when we have that, we can create real change. One last thing, accountability. We need to understand, and I've written about this, and Andy knows my views very well. It's no good going back to Parliament. Parliament, the financial industry is ingrained within Parliament. Government needs the finance industry and banks, because that is how government sustains its own power. So the idea that you'll find accountability within the parliamentary system is an oxymoron. It cannot be. So we need to have a group of people, perhaps a committee of elders that stands outside of that and can, in fact, offer the final sanction. Anyway, I offer those thoughts to you all as a potential for consideration. Thank you for listening.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Dr. Schmuller, I can't see who's got their hands up. Does anybody else have their hand up who hasn't yet spoken? Who hasn't yet spoken? If so,
no one that I can see.
thank you. In which case, Dr. Schmuller, can we go back to you, please, for your final comments? Then we'll go to John and to Mark. Thank you very much, Dr. Schmuller.
Please call me Andy. I think, Mark said, don't be too despondent. I do try and cheer myself up, Mark, by telling myself, by reminding myself that there are thousands of people in our financial industry who go to work every day and work themselves to a standstill just to keep me relevant in my field. So as long as they keep doing it, I'll be relevant in my field, and they're going to do it forever if we don't stop them. So one of the things I think that one of the good things that I do think can come out of these kinds of engagements is don't underestimate the persuasive power of a few individuals who are armed with the correct information and who are in the right places to advocate and agitate for change, not because we are bored, but because we see manifest injustice. And not only don't underestimate the capacity of a few individuals to move the dial. What did Margaret Mead say? Never underestimate the power of a few individuals to change the world, for in fact they are the only ones who ever have. And don't underestimate the value that I gain as much as you gain from these kinds of communications, because then I'm able to learn from what is happening in other jurisdictions and put our politicians on the spot and say to them, the senior manager's certification regime in the United Kingdom even contemplates jail time. And you've stripped the mere possibility of a fine out of our senior managers regime and all the arguments that you're presenting as to why you needed to do this, but they don't have to do that in the United Kingdom. So how valid are your arguments? Those are the kinds of interactions. This is the kind of cross-intellectual seeding, which actually proves very, very valuable. And finally, don't underestimate the value of learning from those jurisdictions or acknowledging those jurisdictions where things, they may not be good, but even if they're just better, even if something is just marginally better, that's a stick with which people like me can go and beat the regulators and beat the politicians. And why aren't you improving things? And it's been done elsewhere, so it's clearly not impossible. It's clearly wrong to, and I'll put it in the Australian vernacular for you. They're very quick to say it's too hard. It's too hard. It's too difficult. It's not too hard. It's not too difficult. They're doing it elsewhere. So to my mind, that is part of the value of these kinds of interactions. And Andy, as ever, and I've had a great deal to do with you over the last couple of years, and particularly our time together in Brussels and the work we did for the European Parliament. And Andy, you're a saint, and I think it's past due the time that you were mentioned in His Majesty's birthday honours.
Andy, thank you very much indeed for your very kind comments. I don't know if you can hear it, folks, but behind me I've got Big Ben, and it's just been making some bell noises. Here I am, outside the mother of all parliaments. Mr. Mark Bannister, I still have faith in parliamentary democracy, sir. I still have faith that our politicians can do their job and speak up for those who aren't yet being properly represented. I still have faith that our politicians can hold our regulators and other financial organisations to account. I still have faith that they, through us, can make a difference and do the job that they're there to do. Andy Schmiller, thank you very much. Mr. John Adams, please share your final comments. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you, Andy, and thanks for everyone for the opportunity to talk today. Look, I'll just make a couple of very, very quick comments. The journey of ASIC reform is not over. I think there's a lot of runway left to go. One of the reasons why ASIC has been able to get away with so much for so long is because it has not been accountable to anyone. And in some ways, it's perhaps one of the most powerful agencies in the Commonwealth, because for example, our intelligence services is overseen by an Inspector General. The Inspector General for the intelligence services can go in and investigate any matter, any time, to make sure that the intelligence services are following the law. ASIC does not have an Inspector General sitting over it. The only thing that it's been supervising it for 30 years has been Parliament, and Parliament has done a pretty poor job at supervising. But now we have this new body called the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and there are multiple references already to the NAC. There will be corruption investigations. We're going to go through this organisation with a fine-tooth comb, and I think we're going to really shake the. We're going to really move the needle. But in a couple of days' time, I'll be in Canberra talking to various politicians about ASIC reform. So I'll be very interested to see what sort of feedback I get behind closed doors. I think we've done some good work over the last couple of years, and we've got some momentum. It's just about sort of bringing the Parliament to the final resting place. The one, someone made I think Mark made a comment about the Australian Labor Party. Labor, before the 2022 election, was advocating for fixing ASIC. Some of the backbenchers in Labor in 2022, when I spoke to them, they basically were on our side. And then they got muzzled by the front bench, the Treasurer and the Minister for Financial Services. For reasons I still don't fully understand why that's happened. But the rest of the Parliament is united in Australia. that ASIC reform is something that has to happen, because when something goes wrong in the financial system, politicians hear it from their constituents when financial losses mount. So I think we have a lot of political momentum. We just have a few. Our treasury is a problem, but even if there's a change of government, I think there's enough political capital that we can actually get some genuine ASIC reform happening in Australia over the next 3 to 5 years. Thank you, Andy, for your opportunity to speak.
You're most welcome, sir. Thank you. Folks, if my phone goes, I'm about to run out of battery, so I'll have to ask Mark Bishop to be as succinct as possible. I've already had the idea, guys and girls. We're going to hold this meeting again in about 3 months' time. Perhaps once a quarter, we bring the two hemispheres together. We catch up on what's happening in relation to ASIC. We catch up on what's happening in relation to the FCA. And I'm pretty sure we can help make a difference. Margaret Mead's quotation, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Mr. Mark Bishop, as succinctly as possible, sir, can you please share your final comments? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to start with a lame joke and use it to make an observation about how we might possibly win this war. So my lame joke is, how many psychotherapists does it take to change the light bulb? The answer is 1, but the light bulb has to want to change. And the reason why I mention that is that actually the way we may fix this is for the industry to want change to happen. If the industry wants change to happen, it will. If the industry doesn't want change, you haven't got a chance. Personally, I suspect this is the case. And how do you make the industry want this to happen? Well, actually, make as much noise as possible every time there is a misconduct and regulatory failure case, and do as much harm as you can to consumer confidence in the industry. Because there is, in economics, there is a thing called a deadweight loss, which is basically when both industry and consumers suffer a loss because what should be mutually profitable transactions don't occur for whatever reason. In this case, because consumers don't trust the industry. Actually, that is the thing that's economically harmful to the honest majority in the industry, is that we don't trust it. We think that the outcomes for us will be poor. So try to make as much noise as you can when things go wrong. Also, use guerrilla tactics. This can mean group litigations against firms that have misbehaved, maybe one day suing regulators if you can. I don't know if you can in Australia. And the other thing is private criminal prosecutions, which is something we're looking at in the UK, whether that's for senior executives of firms or whether it's regulators. So if you create an environment in which actually the economic incentive to have captured regulation is reduced and eliminated, and the pain involved in misconduct becomes higher, at some point they will flip and say, actually, it suits us to have proper regulation. So that may be a way forward for us. I absolutely agree with Andy, we should do this from time to time. I don't know whether Andy is now lost the battery or not, but he does appear to have frozen. So I'm going to say, unless Andy comes back in the next couple of seconds, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody and say thank you very much indeed for attending this event. And as Andy has suggested, we'll be organising another similar one in a few months' time. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. And particularly thank you to those of you in the Southern Hemisphere. A big round of applause for you being prepared to stay on the line so late. It must be kind of midnight or something where you are. So thank you very much indeed, and see you all again soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. My connection just reawakened. Let's bring the session to a close. It's been a wonderful conversation. Let's repeat this in about 3 months' time, and we'll go from there. Can I just repeat what Mark just said? Thank you, everybody, particularly those in the Southern Hemisphere who've been joining us at a pretty unsociable hour. Mark, thank you. John Adams, thank you. Dr. Shmulo, Andy Shmulo, thank you. And of course, Senator Bragg too. We'll bring the session to a close there. We'll circulate the recording as soon as possible. And trust me, this meeting is going to be the beginning of something. We'll do something pretty intelligent with it, and we'll try to bring about some real meaningful change. There are just too many people who've been hurt as a direct consequence of catastrophic regulatory failure. And just like Mark Bishop said, the deadweight loss as a consequence of the reputational damage caused by the bad actors in the industry who have been badly regulated and badly enforced against is something that none of us want. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Cheerio. Waving from outside Big Ben in London. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.